If the fragile ceasefire between Iran and its adversaries collapses, the entire geopolitical landscape of the Middle East could shift within hours, pulling regional and global powers into a rapidly escalating crisis that no single nation can easily control. At its core, a breakdown of the ceasefire would not just mean the return of military strikes or border tensions, it would signal the collapse of a delicate diplomatic framework that has been holding back a much wider confrontation involving intelligence operations, proxy forces, and direct state-to-state threats. In the immediate aftermath, we would likely see a sudden surge in missile activity, airstrikes, and cyber warfare as both state and non-state actors respond to the breakdown with calculated retaliation. Energy infrastructure would instantly become a priority target, especially oil and gas facilities in the Persian Gulf region, which could trigger global market shockwaves and send fuel prices sharply upward. Shipping routes near the Strait of Hormuz could face disruptions, creating uncertainty in global trade, since a significant percentage of the world's petroleum passes through this narrow corridor. As tensions escalate, the involvement of regional allies and adversaries would become almost unavoidable. Countries aligned with Iran in various strategic networks may activate proxy groups across multiple conflict zones, including Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, turning localized tensions into a multi-front regional confrontation. On the other side, nations opposing Iran's regional influence could respond with coordinated military positioning, intelligence sharing, and defensive deployments, further increasing the risk of miscalculation. The danger in such a scenario is not only intentional escalation, but also accidental confrontation, where a single misinterpreted strike or defense response could trigger a wider war cycle. In such high-pressure conditions, communication channels between military command structures become critical, yet history shows that during breakdowns in ceasefire agreements, these channels are often the first to weaken or become unreliable. Meanwhile, global powers such as the United States would be forced into a rapid reassessment of their strategic posture. Any collapse of ceasefire conditions involving Iran would immediately raise questions in Washington about military readiness, alliance commitments, and deterrence strategy. Naval forces in key regions could be repositioned, air defense systems placed on heightened alert, and diplomatic efforts intensified in parallel. But time becomes a critical factor. The longer the conflict remains uncontrolled, the more difficult it becomes to contain it within regional boundaries. Global markets would likely react within minutes, with investors shifting away from risk assets, leading to volatility in oil, gold, and stock markets worldwide. Humanitarian concerns would also begin to rise quickly as civilian populations in conflict-adjacent regions face displacement, infrastructure damage, and shortages of essential supplies. In this opening phase of collapse, uncertainty dominates every level of decision-making, from military command rooms to international financial centers, setting the stage for a crisis that could expand far beyond its original trigger if diplomatic intervention does not reestablish control quickly. If the ceasefire involving Iran fully collapses and the conflict continues to escalate beyond the initial phase, the second stage would likely be defined by rapid militarization, widening regional involvement, and a dangerous shift from limited strikes to sustained, coordinated warfare. At this point, military operations would no longer be symbolic or deterrent-based. They would become strategic campaigns aimed at degrading the opponent's long-term capabilities. Air defense systems, missile bases, naval assets, and command and control infrastructure would become primary targets. This would significantly increase the intensity of attacks across multiple fronts, including land, air, and cyber domains. Cyber warfare, in particular, would play a critical role, as critical infrastructure such as power grids, communication networks, banking systems, and transportation hubs could be disrupted without a single physical strike. The result would be a highly complex battle space where traditional front lines no longer exist, and attacks can originate from multiple directions simultaneously. At the regional level, the collapse of the ceasefire would almost certainly activate a network of allied and proxy forces connected to Iran and its adversaries. Armed groups operating in neighboring countries could intensify operations, targeting military bases, supply routes, and diplomatic installations. This would stretch the conflict far beyond a single geographic zone, effectively transforming it into a regional security crisis. Countries bordering conflict zones would face immediate pressure to secure their airspace, borders, and critical infrastructure, while also dealing with internal security threats and refugee flows. Humanitarian conditions would deteriorate rapidly as civilians become increasingly caught between advancing military operations and retaliatory strikes. International aid organizations would struggle to operate safely in such an environment, leading to shortages of food, medicine, and basic services in affected areas. On the global stage, major powers would face extremely difficult strategic decisions. For example, the United States and its allies would need to balance deterrence with de-escalation, deciding whether to increase military presence or push harder for emergency diplomatic negotiations. Meanwhile, global energy markets would experience severe instability, especially if production or shipping routes are disrupted in key oil-producing regions. A prolonged escalation involving Iran would also increase the risk of broader economic slowdown as inflation pressures rise and investor confidence weakens. International organizations such as the United Nations would likely call emergency sessions, but their ability to enforce peace would remain limited without cooperation from major powers. In this second phase, the crisis evolves from a regional conflict into a systemic global concern, where military, economic, and political risks become deeply interconnected and increasingly difficult to separate or control. If the ceasefire involving Iran completely breaks down and the conflict enters a prolonged, uncontrolled phase, the third and most dangerous stage would likely be characterized by full-scale regional destabilization and the risk of a wider international confrontation. At this point, the conflict would no longer be defined by limited strikes or proxy engagements, but by sustained military campaigns that could reshape borders of influence and fundamentally alter security alliances across the Middle East. Once escalation reaches this level, the probability of direct state-to-state clashes increases significantly, raising fears of a broader war that could draw in multiple global and regional powers. Strategic assets such as long-range missile systems, naval fleets, and advanced air power would dominate the battlefield, while defensive systems would struggle to maintain full coverage against simultaneous multi-vector attacks. The situation would become extremely unpredictable, as each side may attempt to gain rapid advantage before diplomatic intervention becomes possible. Inside the region, the humanitarian impact would reach catastrophic levels. Populations in conflict-affected areas would face large-scale displacement, creating one of the most severe refugee crises in recent history. Neighboring countries would come under immense pressure as they attempt to manage border security, while also dealing with the influx of displaced civilians. Essential infrastructure such as hospitals, water systems, and power grids could collapse under sustained pressure, leading to long-term instability even after active fighting slows. Economic systems within affected countries would likely suffer deep structural damage, with trade routes disrupted, industries shut down, and unemployment rising sharply. In such an environment, recovery would take years, if not decades, depending on the duration and intensity of the conflict. Humanitarian agencies would face enormous challenges in delivering aid, especially in areas where security conditions remain volatile and access is restricted. On the global level, a full collapse of the ceasefire involving Iran would trigger a prolonged period of uncertainty in international markets and diplomatic relations. Energy security would become a central global concern, especially if oil production or transportation routes are significantly affected. Governments worldwide would likely adopt emergency economic measures to stabilize inflation and secure energy supplies. At the same time, international diplomacy would enter a critical phase, with urgent negotiations attempting to prevent further escalation or spillover into other regions. However, the longer the conflict persists, the more difficult it becomes to restore trust between parties, making a negotiated settlement increasingly complex. In the worst-case scenario, the world could enter a new era of prolonged geopolitical fragmentation, where alliances harden, conflicts become more frequent, and global stability is permanently weakened. As the situation continues to unfold, one question now stands at the center of global attention. Is this the beginning of a controlled de-escalation, or the early stages of a much larger conflict that the world may no longer be able to contain? while leaders scramble behind closed doors and military forces stay on high alert. The reality is that even a single miscalculation could reshape the future of an entire region. And as tensions continue to rise, the next development could be more shocking than anything seen so far. Stay tuned, because in the next update we will bore the bigwati. We will break down what happens if major global powers are forced to directly intervene in this escalating crisis.